Hello and greetings, everyone. I want to welcome you to this Primary Source online seminar about human trafficking and the abolition movement today. Our session will examine modern-day global slavery and the movement to end it as well. And our speaker this evening, I'm so pleased to let you know, is Kenneth Morris, who's the founder and president of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, which specializes in working specifically with schools and teachers to prevent and ultimately eliminate human trafficking. So Ken, let me say welcome to you. We are so pleased to have you with us tonight, and we're really looking forward to your talk in just a little while. I am Susan Zeiger. I'm a program director at Primary Source, and I'll be introducing our presenter shortly. But let me say first just a few words. The webinar this evening is part of a three-part series this spring on ways to engage students, U.S. students especially, in thinking about global campaigns for justice around the world and in their own country. So on January 18th, we had our first session, Sports and the Right to Play, a global human rights issue with researcher, athlete, and international disability rights advocate Eli Wolf. Then last month, we had Teaching the UN Sustainable Development Goals with global education specialist, Dr. Anne-Marie Gleason, who is also my colleague and a program director at Primary Source. And Anne-Marie has co-planned this series with me and is with us tonight and will be helping, I believe, moderate our discussion a little bit later. So welcome, Anne-Marie. And then, of course, we close out the series this evening with an examination of the Abolition campaign to end modern-day global slavery. But this is not the end of the learning opportunity tonight, because all of these webinars are recorded and shared on our YouTube channel. This is our second year of the Global Social Action Series for schools and teachers. Last year, our series of 3 examined children's human rights around the world, transnational perspectives on violence against women, and the global climate action movement. And all of those recordings can be found on our YouTube channel. And we'll say more about that later tonight when we talk about resources. This entire series on social justice issues in global context was designed with middle and high school teachers in mind, and it's made possible by a generous grant from the Cummings Foundation, which to whom we are extremely grateful for that support. And finally, I want to welcome all of you who are joining us from many parts of the country. You've braved some spring snowstorms, and we're rescheduled tonight, and so glad to be together. I guess it's really Ken who braved the snowstorm and getting into Chicago a few weeks ago, and I want to thank you for making the time to join us this evening. A special acknowledgement to those of you who are participating in the full series for PD credit. We've been really excited to read your reflections about the first 2 sessions, and we look forward to what you'll share about tonight as well. Later in the hour, we'll have a designated block of time for your questions and comments, and we encourage you to begin entering your thoughts as soon as they occur to you in the chat box in the lower left of your computer screen. You just can type into the little box with a smiley face and then push enter after that, and your post will come up for the whole group to see. Finally, toward the end of the session tonight, we'll have an opportunity to share some high-quality classroom resources that Primary Source has curated in conjunction with this session. These are available for anyone who'd like to use them. They're gathered together in a free online resource guide, which is one of our 60 or more topical resource guides for global and multicultural learning in schools offered by Primary Source. And so that is a good segue for me to say just a word about our organization for those of you who are new to us. Primary Source is a not-for-profit organization that partners with educators to bring global and cultural understanding into K-12 classrooms and schools. We are more than 25 years old. We were founded by teachers. The heart of our work is professional development. That's carried out in many different formats, face-to-face, online, in study tours, at book discussion groups, and so forth. We are as well a resource center for global education and world learning. We do curriculum development and school consulting as well. We welcome you to join us and learn more about our work, and we'll close out this evening by sharing some easy ways for you to do that. So with that, let's turn to our topic for this evening. When Primary Source began planning for this series more than a year ago, it quickly became clear to Anne-Marie and myself that modern-day slavery would necessarily be one of our topics. And that's the case really for three main reasons. First, this has been an issue like the issue of child soldiers, refugee rights, and a handful of others that are truly compelling to young people, and that young people, students in high schools throughout our country have embraced and made their own. There are numerous social justice clubs and human rights organizations in schools around the U.S. that work on this issue. And some of those student representatives may be joining us tonight. We're so glad to have you with us if that's the case. So because of this strong student interest, teachers have asked us for more background, for the best, most reliable data sources and information that are honest but not sensationalized. And we definitely wanted to respond by creating this event this evening. As well, at Primary Source, we are always on the lookout for curriculum entry points that allow educators to link social justice issues today to topics they teach or are expected to teach in their curriculum. The history of slavery and abolition is definitely one of those curriculum connection points where a current issue can bring history to life and make it relevant, and where history in turn can help illuminate our present situation. Certainly, I wish it were no longer a relevant topic, but heartbreakingly it is, and so it's a very important one for schools and teachers to be thinking about in its current incarnation. And finally, the third reason we felt compelled to address this topic in our Teacher Professional Development Series, among the people most vulnerable to trafficking in the U.S. are adolescents. So part of the learning for teachers and students necessarily needs to be about awareness, prevention, and support for young people who have been victimized or could become so, who are at risk of becoming so. And for all these reasons, we are so very fortunate to have Kenneth Morris as our speaker tonight. Ken Morris is a human trafficking educator and abolition activist whose work is deeply informed by history, his own and that of our nation as a whole. His work weaves together all three of the areas I've outlined. Kenneth Morris, I'm so glad to introduce to you now, is founder and president of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. Kenneth is descended from two of the most important figures in American history. He is the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass and the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. As I said, he's also the founder of the nonprofit Frederick Douglass Family Initiative, which uses education in schools across the U.S. to address and prevent contemporary forms of slavery and human trafficking. Ken has been featured in the media on many occasions on CNN, USA Today, PBS, NPR, and in the recent National Geographic documentary, Rise Up, The Legacy of Nat Turner. He's received numerous awards and honors for his efforts. In June 2012, for example, he received the National Park Service's Network to Freedom Underground Railroad Frederick Douglass Legacy Award. And in January 2014, Ken was awarded the Women's E-News 21 Leaders for the 21st Century Ida B. Wells Award for Bravery in Journalism, Ida B. Wells being one of my own personal heroes. Ken strongly believes, as did Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, that knowledge is the pathway to freedom. So Ken, we are so grateful and so glad to have you here tonight. We welcome you to turn on your mic and to begin your talk, and we are very eager to learn from you and to hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Susan. I appreciate that very kind introduction, and it's an honor to be here with you tonight. I'd like to also thank Anne-Marie and Stephanie for inviting me to be a part of this and Primary Source. And of course, thanks to everyone who has logged in to listen to the presentation. I'm looking forward to talking to you about the work that we do around human trafficking prevention education in schools, and also talking about the life and legacy of two great American heroes who happen to be my ancestors. And Susan, as I was listening to you read that introduction, I pinch myself every time I think about being a descendant of these two great men, Douglass and Washington. And it's interesting because when I'm in schools and I say I'm the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass and the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington, not only is it a mouthful trying to spit out all of those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel far removed. And everyone there may be listening and having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection is to Douglass and Washington. It's like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with all of those zeros. But I bet just about everybody listening knows or knew a grandparent, and some of you may have known a great-grandparent. Well, that's how close I feel to both Douglass and Washington, because you see, my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 103 years old, and she met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, was Booker T. Washington's daughter, and she lived to be 95 years old. And I remember being a little boy and sitting on my great-grandmother Fanny Douglass's lap, and she would tell me what it was like to know, as she would call him, the man with the great big white hair. And I remember sitting on my Aunt Portia's lap, and she would tell me firsthand stories about her father, Booker T. Washington. And one day, when I was talking to a group of students and we were trying to wrap our minds around the distance between the generations, I had this profound thought that hit me. Hands that touched the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touched mine. So in a sense, I can say, even with all of those greats, I stand just one person away from history. I stand one person away from slavery. Now, we started our organization in 2007, and we found that when we go into the classroom and we talk about these very sensitive subjects like sex trafficking and slavery, that we have to wrap it really within the context of history, which tends to soften some of those very prickly edges. And so everything that we do starts with the foundation of history. So I'll be talking about Frederick Douglass and his story, and Booker T. Washington and his story, and then we'll transition into talking about human rights and slavery that still exists today, and then give some suggestions on what we all can do to address this issue. So what I'd like to do right now is really set the landscape, or set the stage for what I'm about to talk about. The International Labor Organization estimates that there are 20.9 million victims of human trafficking globally. 68% of them are trapped in forced labor. 26% of them are children. 55% are women and girls. Human trafficking is a $150 billion a year industry worldwide. The U.S. Department of Labor has identified 139 goods from 75 countries made by forced and child labor. In 2015, an estimated 1 out of 5 endangered runaways reported to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children were likely child sex trafficking victims. Of those, 74% were in the care of social services or foster care when they ran. There is no official estimate of the total number of human trafficking victims in the U.S. The leading anti-trafficking organization, Polaris Project, estimates that the total number of victims nationally reaches into the hundreds of thousands when estimates of both adults and minors and sex trafficking and labor trafficking are aggregated. The U.S. anti-trafficking effort is now in its 17th year. It began with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. Since then, the focus has been on restoring and rescuing victims of human trafficking. This work has been led mostly by law enforcement officials through the Department of Justice and victim service personnel through the Department of Health and Human Services. These two departments have helped to implement a victim-centered approach to anti-trafficking. Unfortunately, there has been very little focus on preventing new victims from entering the horrific cycle of abuse and exploitation to which they are subjected to in modern forms of slavery. The stated fundamental framework for addressing human trafficking worldwide was formed by the 3 Ps: prevention, protection, prosecution, and later adding the 4th P, partnerships. The current anti-trafficking strategy is focused primarily on what happens after someone is victimized. The federal government will tell you that they are doing a lot of work around prevention through trainings for law enforcement, prosecutors, health professionals, and other stakeholders in the communities. This is important work, but a strategy that is designed only to help identify victims in an effort to prevent further victimization is not enough. Without a substantial prevention education strategy, there is nothing to interrupt the cycle of new victims coming in and out of the system. Developing an educational framework that makes young people unfit to be exploited through human trafficking and unwilling to exploit others requires a commitment to do so, then an investment to fund that commitment. Preventing someone from being trafficked will not only eliminate an immeasurable degree of pain and suffering on the part of a victim, but it reduces the heavy burden of cost to communities for services to rescue and restore that person. So I'm going to talk to you about what we're doing around primary prevention and preventing new victims from coming and entering into that cycle of exploitation. But before I jump into the details of how we do that, I'm going to talk about the history of our family. Because of my unique connection to history, everything we do is based on the foundation of history. So you see on the screen, the question that I get when people meet me for the first time usually is, well, wait a minute, Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington were not related to each other, so how is it you're related to both of them? Well, here's how it happened. It happened on my mother's side of the family. My grandfather, Frederick Douglass III, whom you see on the left side of the screen, was Frederick Douglass's great-grandson. And my grandmother, Nettie Hancock Washington, was Booker T. Washington's granddaughter. My grandparents met in 1941 at Tuskegee Institute, which is a school that Booker T. Washington founded in 1881. They happened to be on campus the same day. They were rushing to get to the other side, and they literally bumped into each other, didn't know that the other descended from an historic family. They fell in love at first sight and then wound up getting married 3 months later. So this is a photograph of my grandparents on their wedding day. And on the right side of the screen is my grandmother's brother, Booker T. Washington III. So the significance of this photo is you have Booker T. Washington III shaking hands with Frederick Douglass III, and thus the two families are officially united. And here's a photograph of Frederick Douglass with my great-great-great-grandmother, Anna Murray Douglass. Anna and Frederick were married for 44 years. And she was a very important person in his life and an important person in history. Whenever we talk to students, we always like to tell them that we're making history today. Everything that we're doing right now, everything that we're doing on this webinar will guide us and push us forward in history. And Anna was born a free black woman in Baltimore. And when Frederick was enslaved in Baltimore, they met each other. And she was the person that really planted the seed in his mind that he was not meant to be a slave. And as they were starting to fall in love with each other, she said to him, Frederick, I don't want our children's father to be a slave. And once he would finally have the courage to run away from slavery, she would help to finance his escape by selling a feather bed and then sewing a disguise for him, a sailor's outfit, costume that he would wear. And he would eventually escape to New York City. She would meet him there, and they would get married. So had Anna not planted that seed of thought in his mind, history might have taken a different course, and we'd be a very different country than we are today. So we are just as proud of Anna as we are of Frederick. Now, here's a photograph of Booker T. Washington, and I love this one because he was all about education. He was known as the great educator, and you see him there with books in his lap. Now, Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He was born on the eastern shore of Maryland to an enslaved woman and to a white man, and it was presumed that his father was his master. He never had a pair of pants or shoes until he was 8 years old. He used to sleep headfirst in an old corn sack on cold winter nights with his feet hanging out because that was the only way that he could keep himself warm. He only saw his mother 3 times his whole life, and that's because she lived on a plantation that was 12 miles away. So in order for her to see her son, she would have to work in the fields picking cotton from sun up to sundown, and then she would walk 12 miles in the middle of the night and spend just a few moments with him until he would fall asleep, and then she would walk 12 miles back so that she could be back on the plantation by the time the sun came up, because if she wasn't, she was most likely going to face a brutal beating. He didn't know his brothers and sisters. He said his siblings were like strangers to him. So here you have this boy who had no family, and he had no home, and he had no country. But in spite of all of that, through education, he was able to rise up from slavery and go on to affect the lives of millions of people. And I like to tell students about his story because many of the young people that we talk to are in underserved areas, and they're facing their own challenges and their own obstacles that they think are sometimes too great to overcome. And when they hear the story about Frederick Douglass, how he started with nothing and he was able to go on and become a great American hero, his legacy becomes a tangible example for a young person to say that if he was able to overcome slavery and do that, then there's nothing in their lives, in their own lives, that they can't accomplish. Now, Frederick had something that happened in his life that he called divine providence in his favor. And that was he was chosen from among all of the slave children on the plantation on the eastern shore of Maryland to go to Baltimore, to the big city, to be the house servant for his master's brother. Now, when he got there, his slave mistress had never had slaves before, and she didn't know that it was illegal to teach him to read and write. So she began to teach young Frederick his ABCs. But when his master, Hugh Auld, found out about it, his master got angry, and he forbade it. And he looked at his wife, Sophia, and he looked at Frederick, and he said, "You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave." And Frederick heard that message loud and clear, and he looked at his master and he said, if you don't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to get it. And he understood right then and there that knowledge was power and education would be his pathway to freedom. So he would begin to teach himself to read and write. And he was very clever in the way that he would do that. He would trade bread for reading lessons with the children in the neighborhood. Now, keep in mind, had he stayed on the plantation on the eastern shore of Maryland, he wouldn't have been in an environment where he could learn how to read and write because most of the slaves on that plantation were illiterate. But now that he was in the big city, he was around free black children that knew how to read and write, and he was also around white children. And so he was very clever. Now, in his autobiography in 1845, published in 1845, he wrote that he was always so hungry as a slave child. And he always had this pit of hunger in his stomach that would never go away. And on occasion, when he would get food, the overseer would take cornmeal mush, throw it into a pig straw, and all of the children, including Frederick, would crawl on their hands and knees as fast as they could to try to eat what little food was in there, to eat like pigs, to eat like animals, because that's what he was considered. He was property. He did not own himself. Now, if you jump back to the story that I just told about how he taught himself how to read and write by trading bread for reading lessons, trading food for reading lessons, this is a great message for young people because Frederick would rather feed his mind and have his belly go empty. And so it's a great message to students about literacy. Now, I don't have an hour and a half tonight to go through his whole story, so I'm going to fast forward through many parts of it. But I want you to know that eventually, at the age of 20, he would have the courage to run away from slavery. He would meet up with Anna, as I said, in New York City and get married, and then they would make their way along the Underground Railroad and eventually settle in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And once he got to New Bedford, Massachusetts, he began to work because he had a skill that he had gained as a ship caulker from his time working on the ship docks in Baltimore. Now, Frederick wasn't just satisfied with working, earning a living, and starting a family with Anna. He looked back and he saw that there was this legal institution of slavery that needed to be brought down, that needed to be dismantled. And he, along with the other abolitionists, got to work and worked to eventually end slavery. And again, this is another great lesson for young people. It's about activism and social service and fighting against injustice. Frederick looked at this legal institution and he got to work and he was active around bringing down the institution of slavery. Now, Booker T. Washington was born a slave as well. Now, he benefited from the work of Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists and the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and he and his family were freed when he was 9 years old. He wanted to go to school so badly that he worked in the salt and coal mines of West Virginia at night so he could begin his lessons during the day. And one evening when he was in the salt mines, he heard these two older gentlemen talking about this place called Hampton Institute in Virginia. And they were talking about Hampton as a place where formerly enslaved Americans could go and get an education. Now, Booker had no concept of college or higher education, but what he was hearing from these gentlemen to him sounded like heaven. And he was going to do everything in his power to be able to go to Hampton. So he would continue to work and eventually save enough money, and with the help of the community pitching in, he would make a 500-mile walk at the age of 16 to go to school. Now, if you can imagine, that walk took a long time. He ran out of money several times. He had to take odd jobs along the way. He slept under bridges. But nothing was going to deter him from his goal of getting to college. And so he would eventually make it to Hampton. He would go straight to the headmistress of the school to ask if he can be admitted. And she took one look at him. He was dirty. He was disheveled. His clothes were torn. He probably didn't smell so great. But he was not going to take no as an answer. He had learned the value of hard work, working in those salt and coal mines in West Virginia. And so he would come back every day and ask her again, I want to go to school here. And she would say no, and he would come back. And finally, after asking so many times, the headmistress said, okay, Booker, you're driving me crazy here. I'm going to give you an opportunity to prove yourself. Let's see what you can do. There's a dirty classroom down the hallway. Why don't you clean that and then come back and talk to me? So Booker went in and he cleaned that classroom so well, and then when she came back, the headmistress came back to do the white glove test. She was looking for dust and dirt on the windowsills and on the tables. Not only did she find dust, she didn't find one speck of dirt. And she looked at Booker and she said, okay, you will do for admission into the school. And not only that, we're going to give you the job as a janitor so you can work your way through college. Now, at the age of 25 years old, after he graduated, he was asked to come down to this place called Tuskegee, Alabama, to start a school for formerly enslaved Americans. And he accepted that challenge, and he rushed down to Tuskegee, and when he looked around, he couldn't find an old church or an old schoolhouse to begin his lessons. There was nothing but dirt as far as the eye could see. But he didn't let that get him down. That was not an obstacle that it was too great to overcome. He started recruiting students, and he started getting them excited about getting an education. And one of the first things that he taught them how to do was how to make bricks so that they could build their own school. And so you see the students at Tuskegee building what is now Tuskegee University, a school that has educated millions of African Americans and their families. Now, Booker understood that education started with the basics. You couldn't start reaching for the higher aims in life until you could meet your basic needs in life. And that meant education started with hygiene, teaching them how to brush their teeth, how to tie their shoes. But what he did most importantly was he taught them a trade, a skill, so that they could have a stake in the nation's growing economy. Now, you have to remember that they just came out of race-based slavery, and so racism was very strong, and it was right on the surface. And Booker understood that rather than demanding that the white race just change their ways or their attitudes, he showed freed African Americans how they could change themselves, how they could overcome obstacles, develop strength of character, and rise by their own efforts to honorable positions of respect, but most importantly, self-esteem. So Washington was a leader who brought stability at a time of transition from enslavement to freedom, and it may be said that he is the person that bridged the gap between the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights Movement. Now, I've always known that I descended from these great men. I can't really say when I first found out, but can you imagine growing up and your ancestors are on statues, they're on money, they're on stamps, schools are named for them, bridges are named for them. Everywhere I turned, I was in the long, vast shadow of my ancestors, and I'm sometimes embarrassed to admit that for most of my life, I didn't want anything to do with this. You know, I had talked about my great-grandfather and my grandfather and how he met my grandmother. And Frederick Douglass III, my grandfather, was a brilliant man. He was a surgeon, and in fact, he was down in Tuskegee on that fateful day that my grandparents met because he had been commissioned down there by the Veterans Administration during World War II. So my grandfather always walked around with this weight of expectation on his shoulders, and people expected him to be an iconic leader like his great-grandfather, Frederick Douglass. But there's only one Frederick Douglass. And when my grandmother was 3 months pregnant with my mom, that weight of expectation became too much for him to bear, and he took his own life. So my mother was born without a father. She was raised without a father. And then when I came along and I had this dual lineage, my parents and my grandparents and great-grandparents went in the complete opposite direction, and they weren't going to force anything on me. So I grew up decisively disengaged from this lineage until Providence called in my life. And that was my good friend Robert Benz, and one of the co-founders of our organization, came across this National Geographic magazine cover entitled 21st Century Slaves. And he handed it to me, and he said, you know, this is an issue that we could probably do something about if we can leverage the historical significance of your ancestry. So when I saw that headline, I was stunned. And I reacted the way I think most people do the first time they hear about the existence of human trafficking and modern-day slavery. And I thought it had ended with the work of Frederick Douglass. But as I started to read the article, and as I started to research and read other articles and information that was out there, and I found that slavery still existed in every civilized and uncivilized country around the world, including right here in the United States. And I remember reading an article at night in my living room, and it was about a 12-year-old girl who was forced to be a sex slave in the brothels of Southeast Asia and service countless men during the day. I'm the father of 2 daughters, and at the time my daughters were 12 and 9 years old. And as I'm reading this article down the hallway, I could hear my girls getting ready for bed, and they were saying their prayers, they were reading bedtime stories and laughing and just having a good old time. And I was having an impossible time trying to wrap my mind around what I was reading about this 12-year-old girl in Southeast Asia and what I was hearing down the hallway from my girls. And when I put the magazine down, I walked in to say goodnight to my daughters, and I had this moment where I couldn't look them in the eyes. I couldn't look them in the eyes and walk away and not do something about this. And it was really at that moment when I understood that I had this platform that my ancestors had built through struggle and through sacrifice. And I knew, along with Robert, that we could leverage the historical significance of my ancestry to do something about this issue. So my mom and I and Robert started the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, as I mentioned, in 2007. And our mission when we started was an easy one because it was a given that we would lift up the legacies of our great ancestors. But as we looked at those legacies, we had Frederick Douglass, who was the great abolitionist, and Booker T. Washington, who was the great educator. So our motto would be abolition through education. And if we're going to go about educating the public on the existence of human trafficking, we thought that the best place to start is where education should start in my mind, and that's with young people. So we immediately turned to schools and we started talking about the legacy of both of my ancestors and the work that they did. And once we would talk about historic slavery, then it was a natural for teachers and for students to look through that prism of history and look at contemporary forms of slavery. And when you look at historic slavery and contemporary forms of slavery, if you boil down the basic elements, they're the same. They're about profit. They're about exploiting the most vulnerable among us. It's about dehumanizing and brutalizing people to make money. Nothing's changed. And also we found that when we framed it that way, it was easier for students and teachers and parents to be able to make the connection that slavery has existed throughout time. And if you draw a straight line to today's slavery, it hasn't changed very much. Now, of course, it's not legal anywhere in the world. That's the biggest difference, that it was legal in the 19th century. It's not legal anywhere now. It's an underground illegal activity. but when you look at those basic elements, it's about the same thing. And so we'll talk to students about labor exploitation and slavery in the products that we use and consume every day. And then we'll challenge them to think about how we as consumers, as American consumers, are complicit in allowing slavery to thrive and exist. So we like to go back and forth from history to present day. And so with this example, what we'll ask the students to do is think about if you lived in a free state like Michigan in the 19th century and you wanted to buy a cotton t-shirt. You wanted to get a shirt at a good price and you wanted good quality. And so you would put that shirt on and you would think, man, this looks great on me. It feels good. It's nice and soft. But would you be thinking about how that cotton was harvested and who in the South was brutalized and dehumanized to make that, to harvest the cotton that goes into that shirt? Well, these are the same questions that we should be asking ourselves today as consumers. Do we allow slavery to thrive because we demand products so cheaply? Now, slavery, because of globalization, is in our supply chain. It's in a lot of the products that we use and consume every day. So we want to get students thinking about these issues so that they can make better decisions and help to eradicate this one day. Now, sex trafficking we hear a lot about in the United States, and this is an issue that when I first started in 2007, they said that the average age that a young girl was forced into prostitution was 13 years old, and that's getting younger and younger. And that, again, was the thing that had the greatest impact on me because of the 12-year-old that I was reading about that was the same age as my older daughter. And sex trafficking, also boys can be trafficked as well. And so we spend a lot of time, and I'll talk to you in just a few minutes about how we go about addressing this issue in the classroom, because again, here's one of these very sensitive and prickly subjects that it's a difficult conversation to have in the classroom, but we do wrap it within the context of history, which again tends to soften some of those edges. So I mentioned abolition through education. Our program is called History, Human Rights, and the Power of One. So our curricula always starts with history. We look at some point in history. For instance, we did a project called Globalize 13, which was based on the 150th anniversary of the ratification of the 13th Amendment. And then students studied for the human rights portion, child labor trafficking in the supply chain. And then the Power of One is the service part of all of this. All of our curricula is service learning based, so that once the students and the teachers learn about this in the classroom, then they can go out into their communities and work on activities and projects that raise awareness about this in the community. Now, this project called Protect is a new project for us, and it's very innovative. We have partnered with two nonprofits in California, the California Department of Education and the California Attorney General's Office, to bring human trafficking training of educators and school personnel and a prevention curriculum to the whole state of California. Now, we've gotten a grant to help us get started in the rural counties, and we just began to pilot this in 5 counties 2 months ago. And what this looks like, in order to reach the whole state of California, this is something that we had to bring online. So we have partnered with Cisco Systems, and they provide a learning management platform for us to be able to deliver this training online. And this becomes institutionalized education, because what the California Department of Education asked us to do was to introduce it in the 5th grade, and then again in the 7th grade, the 9th grade, and the 11th grade. In the 5th grade, it's a conversation about circles and boundaries and family and who do you let into that circle. We don't get into any conversation about sex trafficking in the 5th grade or the 7th grade. The 7th grade, it's in a family life class, and then there's a little bit more conversation. We also talk about labor trafficking in this education. And then in the 9th grade, it's in a health class, and that's when we get into the bulk of the education around sex trafficking. In the 11th grade, it's in a U.S. history class, because that's when the service kicks in, and then we make the connection to historical slavery, as I'm doing with this presentation right now. This is how we believe that we can begin to eradicate human trafficking from communities through institutionalized education. So in the same way that Frederick Douglass heard his master say, education will unfit him to be a slave. We want to unfit communities to allow slavery to thrive and exist through education. So it's not just a one-off 2-hour presentation, which is fine. There are a lot of organizations that go in and do an awareness presentation, but we found that if this education is not implemented with some level of measured care, everything can go wrong. And that includes working with stakeholders in the community, like service providers, law enforcement, district attorney's office, any entity in the community that needs to be prepared to respond to a disclosure in the classroom or in a counselor's office or nurse's office needs to be coordinated to respond and provide that safety net. So that's a big part of the program too, is working with counties and with districts and cities to make sure that there are protocols in place specific to responding to incidents of human trafficking. So we're really excited about this program in California. We believe it'll be a model for the rest of the country. We also do what we call legacy projects, and we just announced a project based on Frederick Douglass's bicentennial, which will happen in 2018, and it's called 1 Million Abolitionists. We are publishing a special edition of Frederick Douglass's narrative that I've been talking about for his bicentennial year, and we're going to give it away to 1 million students by the end of his bicentennial in 2018. Now, the Library of Congress named the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, one of the 88 books that shaped America. Published in 1845, Douglass's first autobiography became an instant bestseller, and having just escaped slavery 7 years earlier, put his life in immediate danger. The narrative helped change the course of the U.S. abolitionist movement in the 19th century and has changed the lives of readers ever since. Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives wants to inspire and empower 1 million young people to do and be more than they ever dreamed possible. And in honor of Douglass's 200th birthday, we will print and distribute 1 million hardcover copies of this special edition. And then we're going to ask 1 million students across the country to read the book, and in 2018, in the bicentennial year, participate in meaningful service projects within their communities and internationally. And the students will also have an opportunity to win gifts, trips, and even scholarships. We just launched this project 4 weeks ago at the Library of Congress, and we published 5,000 books to help us get started, and those books have already been committed to students in 5 different cities around the country. So I've been spending the past 3 weeks traveling and handing out those books, and it has been so inspiring to see how young people, how young readers are responding to Frederick Douglass's life story and his words. And really what we want to do with this project is lift up 1 million Frederick Douglasses, 1 million Harriet Tubmans, 1 million Sojourner Truths, and inspire them to affect change in the world around them using Frederick Douglass's words. And if you're familiar with his writings and his speeches, his words are as relevant today as they were when he wrote them 170 years ago. They're as relevant today to the challenges and issues that we face in communities. Now, for the service part of the projects that we do, we've had students that have done amazing projects, students that have trained law enforcement on how to recognize incidents of human trafficking in the community. We've had students present at the UN. Really what we want them to do is use their passion, their talent, and their intellect to work on this issue. So using Frederick Douglass as an example, Frederick published the North Star newspaper out of Rochester, New York, which was the leading abolitionist voice. So he used the power of the pen. So we like to encourage students that are interested and like to write a blog or to contact their local paper and submit an op-ed. We have students doing art auctions and contests, and students who create documentaries that they upload to YouTube, and plays and musicals. Really, the sky's the limit for what these young people come up with when you give them the inspiration, the motivation, and the tools to be able to go out and do this great work. You know, Frederick Douglass said it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And Booker T. Washington said, if you want to lift up yourself, lift up someone else. And our young people are lifting up themselves by working on this global issue that's greater than they are. So history lives in each of us. History doesn't just live in me because I descend from two people that made a difference, but history lives in all of the students that we come into contact with. And I like to think history is important because we need to know where we've come from in order to know where we're headed. And our young people today don't know where they come from, but it's not their fault. And what we found is when we start talking to them about their own family tree and how each and every one of them descends from somebody that made a difference, somebody that gave of their lives for the freedoms that we enjoy, somebody that gave of their lives just so that some of us even have a right to sit in a classroom and get an education. And when a young person starts to connect to that and understand that they have greatness flowing through their veins, just like I do, you see them sitting up straighter in their chairs, and you see them ready and empowered to go out and do this work. History lives in each of us, but the future depends on how we carry that forward, because we are the sons and daughters. We're the grandsons and granddaughters. Some of us are the products of slavery. This country is the product of slavery. And this country is also the product of the abolition of slavery. From Frederick Douglass, we learned that we have a right to be free. And from Booker T. Washington, we learned how to make our way in the world as free citizens. And from Martin Luther King Jr., we learned that as free citizens, we have the same rights as all citizens. When I was growing up, the challenges faced by men like my ancestors were apparent to me because it just so happens their blood flows through my veins. But the fact is, all of us, we live far from the cotton fields. And we're worried more today about our favorite sports team winning a ball game than we are about the threat of being beaten by our overseers. We live in modern times, and the echoes of slavery are hard to hear from where we stand. But if we all listen close enough, we'll hear cries and not echoes from the slaves of today. And when we listen close enough, that's when change will happen. Now, I'm going to close here with a quick story. I was born in Washington, D.C., and I spent all of my summers in Frederick Douglass's summer beach home on the Chesapeake Bay. And then this home is in the southeast portion of Washington, D.C., in the Anacostia neighborhood. And as a little boy, we used to go on field trips to this home. And I loved going into the house and into his library, because in his library, he had books from the ceiling to the floor. And I would look at that and think, this man never spent one day of his life in a classroom. He was a self-taught scholar, and this is where he got his knowledge. And then if you walked upstairs and down the hallway, at the end of the hallway is his bedroom. And you know how when you go into a museum, they always have that velvet rope that blocks off the room so you can't get inside and sit down on the furniture or touch anything. So from the hallway into the room is one of those ropes. And when I was a boy, I always wanted to see what was in that room, so I would stretch my neck over the rope, and if I looked to the left, I could see his bed, and on his bed is his nightshirt. And next to his bed on the chair is his hat. And next to the chair on the floor is a pair of his shoes. And when I was a boy, I always wanted to sneak past that rope and try those shoes on. Now, when we first started in 2007, I was in the visitor center of this home, and I was talking to a group of students, and I told that story, and a young girl about 10 years old raised her hand, and she said, "Mr. Morris, I want to know what it must be like to walk in the shoes of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington." And I said, "How old are you?" That obviously is a deep question. And so once I finished my presentation, the site manager of the home said, "I've got a great idea." And she gathered all of us together. There were about 25 students and me. And we rushed into the house. I was knocking the kids over to get in and show them the library, and then went upstairs, and the site manager said, "Okay, we're going to do something very special here." And as we got down to the room, there was the rope, and the site manager took the rope down, and she said, "Come on in." And as we all rushed in there, gathered in there, it's not a very big room, so we were standing together shoulder to shoulder, almost like sardines. And then the photographer wanted to take the group pictures, so he started placing people, and he said, "You go here, you go here, you go here." And he gets closer to me, and he puts me right next to the shoes. And I looked down, and I said, "There they are." after all of those years, all I would have to do is just slip off my shoes, and I could step right into them, and nobody would ever know. And I'd be standing there, look at me, saying to myself, I'm taking pictures in Frederick Douglass's shoes. But I hear you laughing. But I never did. I never tried those shoes on because I knew that they wouldn't fit. Those shoes are too big for any of us to fit into. But what I realized at that moment was that I could take the shoes that I've got, and you all could take the shoes that you've got, and we can lead the way to a brighter future. We can lead the way to a better tomorrow. And each and every one of us can make the difference in the lives of those around us. And just like Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington and many others, Ida B. Wells, go on to affect change in the world around us. So with that, I thank you all very much for listening. Here's a way to contact us. If you know how to do texting keywords, you can text to 51555, the keyword family, and that will give you some information right to your cell phone on the work that we're doing. Or you could go to our website, which is fdfi.org. And I thank you all very much for listening. I look forward to the questions that you have for me in our conversation. Thank you.
Oh, Ken, thank you so much. That was really a wonderful talk, and it's really amazing to me the variety and creativity of the strategies that your organization is bringing to schools and classrooms and promoting and nurturing. It's really so multifaceted and really impressive. I have to say one of the most, I'm going to remember something you said tonight because it was so hopeful, but I love this thought you left us with, that as a nation we're the product of slavery. I think we all know that, but we're also the product of the abolition of slavery, and that tradition that you're holding up is such an important one for us to embrace, and a hopeful one, as I said. So thank you so much for that. Do you want to try putting your video button on now, and we'll see if we can see you for this next stretch when we take some questions. We've got some great questions coming up in the box here, and I'm eager to share them with you. So I think your video's button is on now, so I'm actually not seeing you, but
I can see. Yeah,
yes, there you go. Okay, it's coming and going. All right. Well, let me begin by calling our attention to several people were interested in the strategy of talking with students about child labor, unfree labor, and the economic dimensions of human trafficking. Andreen wrote a great comment about that, how compelling it would be for students to think about and connect with the understanding the production stream and where unfree labor fits into it, that could be a very high impact. Kara asks a related question and a difficult ethical question. She said, what's the responsibility of American consumers, our students among them, who find out a manufacturer is using forced child or adult labor? If you boycott, the market shrinks, those laborers are out of work without even the meager provisions of the forced labor situation. What happens when that manufacturer moves to a different country that doesn't uphold human rights to find cheaper free labor there? Do you address that in your work? Can you say a few words about that, Ken, or how such conversations have unfolded in the work you've done with students?
Yeah, we have, actually, I mentioned our Globalize 13 curriculum, and then also there's another one, 100 Days to Freedom, and that was based on the 150th anniversary of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and President Lincoln announcing on September 1862 that 100 days later he would sign this document on January 1st, 1863. So the project started in 2012, September, and then culminated in January of 2013. And in both of those projects, we talked about labor trafficking and helping students to understand that these slave labor is in the products that we use and consume every day. And while we cannot boycott, we could boycott a company, but that really is not the great strategy. The greatest strategy to take would be to, again, educate your community, educate yourself, educate your school on the companies that are on the list of supplying, producing products with slave labor. Now, there are organizations out there that are working on helping corporations to clean up their supply chain. So if a company is being active in wanting to clean up their supply chain and looking way down the line, see, here's where the problem lies, is that way down that supply chain is a contractor in another country that is being asked to produce these products very cheaply, and so that they will bring in slave labor. So with students, what they look at is identify the companies that are working to clean up their supply chain and support those companies, and for those companies that are not working to clean up their supply chain, or they haven't put anything out there publicly that they're working on it, or it's not on their website, then as a service project, they've done letter campaigns, writing letters to the corporations to let them know what they found out about how their products are being produced, and that they will work in the community to raise awareness about these companies and their efforts to not clean up their supply chains. And there are many different types of projects that students can get involved with to be able to raise awareness about the companies that are doing a good thing and those companies that are not doing a good thing.
That's an amazingly good example, I think, of a place where kid power students can really make a very big difference, isn't it, with using their voices and the tools of communication and education that you talked about. That's a great example of that and a great service project. Dan is with us tonight and asked a really interesting question. I think that's on a lot of our minds too, which is the issue of sensationalism in the reporting of human trafficking. It seems that this is an issue and a topic that is particularly prone to miscommunication and overhype and fake news and stories. He says, he asks, do you find it difficult today when discussing human trafficking when there's so many sensationalized stories, fake news? A story he mentions that went viral when a woman claimed that she knew two men, she believed two men were following her and trying to kidnap her boys. So there are also ways in which some of these fears can play into some of the uglier underpinnings of fearfulness that people have in our community, fear of each other, fear of people of color, of outsiders, and so forth, taking our children and taking loved ones away. How do you address that very challenging question? Do you have any thoughts for us on that?
I do, and there's a lot there.
Yeah.
But let me say, first of all, that we're talking about primary prevention education, and when I started, I talked about the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 and how we really believe that the federal government misframed how this issue should be addressed, and it really was framed as an international problem, and that any problem that we had in the United States would be bleeding back in through our borders. But those of us that have studied the issue know about the problem and how pervasive it is in the United States. It's been a challenge for us to try and change what's in the public consciousness about how people think about human trafficking. And there were 3 Taken movies that a lot of people saw, and just fighting against Hollywood's version of human trafficking and sex trafficking, and how it's been sensationalized in the media. But also, with organizations that work around this issue, there are lots of organizations that are doing great work, but the focus seems to be on sex trafficking for the most part here in the United States, because that's the issue that you can fundraise around, because nobody can fathom how somebody would want to exploit a child for commercially for sex. And so it's been hard for us because we feel like we've been swimming upstream with this prevention message. You know, we as human beings tend to act with an abundance of heart. So if we see somebody in trouble and a child in trouble, our first inclination is to rescue that child. And then once the child is rescued, they need to go through a restoration and rehabilitation process, and to try and recover from that trauma and to return to any semblance of wholeness is very difficult. And so the way I like to describe how we've been addressing trafficking, when I say we, I'm talking about the abolitionists, the modern day abolitionist movement, it's reactionary. We're reacting after the victimization has occurred. Law enforcement is reacting after the crime has been committed. And if I may use an analogy, all of us remember the British petroleum oil spill, and we remember seeing the videos and the pictures of the wildlife with oil on them, oil in the marshes, washing up on the beaches. It's destroying the seafood industry. It's destroying local businesses in the Gulf. But what British Petroleum did to their credit was they put a camera at the bottom of the ocean, and they showed the world what the priority was. And the priority was capping that well that was spewing millions of gallons of crude into the Gulf of Mexico. Had we not done that, had they not done that first, then we would still be out there in disaster relief mode trying to clean up the oil. Well, this is how we've been addressing human trafficking, is we're in constant disaster relief mode and reacting to what we see on the surface. Now, unfortunately, you can't put a camera into a bedroom and see how children are being exploited by traffickers and being groomed on their cell phones, on their iPads, and right into their bedrooms. But what education does, primary prevention education, it caps the well of this particular disaster so that we're stopping the new victims flowing into that cycle of exploitation. So I'll ask a question that you maybe take away and think about this. If we are just in constant rescue and restore and rehabilitate mode, as well-meaning as we are we contributing to that cycle of exploitation if we're not doing anything to prevent it? Now, this is where teachers come in, and this is why we love working with teachers, because teachers really are on the front line, and they're with the students for 6, 7, 8 hours a day. And when we train them on how to recognize incidents of human trafficking, then they can help not only prevent it, but also recognize signs and be able to intervene and have intervention. And so this prevention message is just really starting to take hold. The project that we're doing in California, the funding that we got to help us get started is, as far as we know, the first time that a foundation has given any significant funding to go primarily toward prevention education. Now, the federal government would tell us that they're doing prevention, but what they're talking about is training of law enforcement, training of agencies on how to recognize victimization to prevent further victimization. That's secondary and tertiary prevention. We're talking about strictly primary prevention. Are you guys still there?
Sorry, that's a really apt metaphor, and I think in connection with that a comment made by one of our participants tonight too, linking this discussion to that of our last session on the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, of course, throughout the world, working on the fundamentals of education and subsistence, more than a subsistence living, and fighting hunger and sustainable development throughout the world is primary prevention against trafficking in all countries. So I think that's a really good point of connection. Well, this might be we'll have a chance, Ken, to bring you back on for some final thoughts, and if anyone wants to add any other questions as we move forward, please feel free to. We can always return to those, but I wanted to just take a few moments to share some resources when we're thinking about breaking through the sensationalism and getting really good information, that's one of the things that that we are very aware of here at Primary Source, is to try to identify best resources that that are really reliable and that can help us to get a handle on what is true and what messages to truthful messages to share with students and for real learning and education. So the first thing I want to let you know is that all of the resources, all the sources that I'll be recommending in this next couple of minutes are gathered together in one place on our Primary Source website, and you'll have access to that. We'll send you the link, and it'll be available to anyone you'd like to share it with. And there's the URL right there on the screen. So that is our Global Action for Social Justice Resource Guide, and there's a tab for each of the 6 webinars that we've held and 6 topics that we've explored together this year and last, and the last of those is human trafficking. So in terms of our resource guide, that's what the resource guide looks like. That was the Sustainable Development Goal page. And in terms of the human trafficking page, we bring together a couple of different kinds of sources. One of the challenges, as I said, for K through 12 educators is to find authoritative and research-based information that can help us talk about trafficking in a way that doesn't exploit or dehumanize victims. And there are absolutely reliable, responsible NGOs and organizations that are seeking to address this complex problem, disseminate knowledge about it. So these include some of the major NGOs and international bodies, and we have identified a number of those on the web guide. Here's one of them. One of the important UN agencies that deals with human trafficking is the Office on Drugs and Crime, because of course, as Ken mentioned, this is an illegal practice, and it's one in every country it's illegal, and it's driven by criminal syndicates and activity. It's one of the reasons it flourishes is because it is such a profitable criminal activity. So this UN body, the UN ODC, does a report each year, and this is an NGO report that you report that you could certainly use for your own background or as a reading exercise for students and learning to read informational text, analyzing data and charts. For instance, you could do some very rich activities with students in your curriculum using reports such as this one. The U.S. government has also been an important source of information about human trafficking. One challenge in our own government is that responsibility for human trafficking resides in many different agencies. It's on the radar of the Justice Department, State Department, Homeland Security, Department of Labor, and so forth. And each of those departments currently does reporting and creates information. But recognizing that this could be somewhat chaotic and uncoordinated, President Obama was a big champion of this cause and this legislation a few years ago, and Ken mentioned this earlier as well. Congress passed the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act in December 2015. And this created an interagency task force, or upgraded an interagency group. And that was a very positive thing, I think, in our own country. An interesting thing that act authorized was the creation of an advisory council to prevent human trafficking. And it mandated that victim survivors and survivor advocates would be invited to serve on this advisory board, would be the members of the advisory board. So for the very first time last year, this group released an official report which got quite a bit of attention. It was authored by the 11 people that you see here who reside in the United States and have themselves experienced human trafficking and modern slavery. Everyone here is a survivor of trafficking. It is a powerful report with a great deal of testimony. So we included a link to this report on our resource page. There's also a link there to an NPR story at the time that the report came out, featuring an interview with one of the authors, Evelyn Chambal, who was an unfree domestic worker. And I feel that these materials could very well be matched with the slave testimonies that were used so effectively, Frederick Douglass's being the supreme example of those. But these testimonies could be used alongside those that many of us teach in our schools to create that same kind of impact and the same important voice for change that the early escaped slaves were voicing, the stories that they were voicing in the 19th century. Another type of material that you'll find in our resource guide is several very good lesson plans and curriculum. One that I like quite a bit is pictured here. It's from Global Nomads Group and UNICEF. They collaborated to create this lesson plan. It uses a 3-part global learning model where students learn background information about the issue of trafficking. They take action and they reflect afterwards on the process. So that's a common strategy for global learning, and it's built around a school-friendly version of the anti-trafficking film Not My Life, with both middle school and high school lessons. So that's one of the good materials you'll find among the lesson plans and curriculum material. And finally, on our web resource page, we have some very good resources for student research and other take action projects, such as the ones that Kenneth described. The one that's featured here in this picture is from the U.S. State Department, the Office of Trafficking in Persons. And this was a project that was done in conjunction with the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, interestingly. So they put together, I think, a great website called Meet the Heroes. These are people from around the world, individuals who are fighting to stop modern slavery. And with each of these thumbnails that you see here, if you follow the photograph, you can find a biography, a short biography and profile about the person's life and the work that they do and the way in which they have attempted to address human trafficking in their own lives and in their own communities. So they're very gripping stories and could really serve very well as a foundation for further student exploration and learning. So with that, I think we are ready to wind down our session. Ken, I would invite you to share any final thoughts or reflections. Is there anything that you'd like to leave us with beyond all that you've already shared with us this evening?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be with you tonight. It was an honor to be able to talk about the work we're doing. You know, it's a lot really to put out there in such a short amount of time, but even looking at the individual projects that we've done, there's a lot of depth to the projects, and the program that we're doing in California, the Protect project, is something that I would encourage everybody to go and visit that website. It's protectnow.org, and you can see what we're doing in California. The feedback that we're getting has been excellent. We're working also with Sacramento State Institute of Research, and they're providing the pre and post surveys for us, and also helping us to be able to pull data out of the project. And so this really will be the first time that we're going to have some information around prevention, education, primary prevention, and because we're delivering the education online through videos and other resources, and also creating a community for teachers to be able to communicate with each other across county lines. We believe that this is a model for the rest of the country, so I would encourage you to take a look at what we're doing there, and hopefully as we begin to expand this into other places around the country, we'll be coming to a district near you.
Marvelous. Thank you so much. That pilot is very exciting, and we'll all be watching it closely. So with that, I want to thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and most of all, Ken, we thank you for your time and input, for the remarkable work that you are doing to carry forth the legacy of abolition and to use education as the powerful tool that it can be for social change. And I invite all of you to stay in touch with us here here at Primary Source. We have summer courses coming up. We have online learning opportunities like this one all year long. And here are the ways that you can find us on the web and social media. So I wish you all good luck and a good night, and stay in touch. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.